Bonjour, aujourd'hui j'ai le plaisir de recevoir Olly Richards, le célèbre polyglotte, pour une interview en anglais sur l'apprentissage des langues. If you're learning French, Spanish, English, Japanese, German, Italian, for example, you've probably come across his great resources for learners, for example his books, short stories in French, conversations, and also online courses. He's the founder of StoryLearning, and you can find him on YouTube and on Instagram. He is I Will Teach You a Language. Olly, thanks for being with me today. And to start with, would you like to add something about yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And no, that's a very good summary, really. I'm from the UK. I grew up without speaking any languages, and then, when I was about 19 years old, I discovered this big wide world out there with lots of languages. And so, that's my background has always been in discovering languages as an adult. And so hopefully the various things that I make and books that I write and stuff like that are helpful for people, because what I try to do is make the resources that I wish that I had when I was first getting started.
Yeah, because 19, well, you're probably younger than me, but there was not that much on internet. Right now we can find a lot of things, but at the time, not so much.
Yeah, there really wasn't. I mean, the internet it existed, but nothing useful. It was like Hotmail, and that was about it. And back then, your only options. I remember when I first started learning languages, I had to go down to the European bookshop in Soho in central London, and there were like 5 books on French and like 3 books on Italian and 1 book on Portuguese, and it was the wrong kind of Portuguese. And then that was it. You couldn't get anything else.
Mhm.
I think a lot about the value of that experience sometimes, though, because I think these days, yes, you can get anything you want, but that often leads to a kind of paralysis, where you have too much stuff. But back then, you had to make do with what was available, and that leads you to focus to a certain extent, I think. So, yeah, I find that a very interesting topic.
Yeah, you had to be very independent, self-motivated, and just go get what you needed. And you started quite late. I mean, it's
Yeah,
19, as you mentioned, you learn as an adult, and it's not the same as when you learn your first language as a kid. And
yeah.
how many? Go ahead.
I meet lots of people these days who do languages at university and at college. I'm so jealous of them, because I think about my friend Alex, for example, that did Russian and German at Cambridge, and I think, wow, like that. It's very difficult later on in your life to have so many years with that much uh, quality, in-depth study.
Yeah,
And so
very.
it's a really great opportunity to be able to do that at university. But yeah, I started with no knowledge, nothing, and just had to figure it out.
Great. And how many languages have you learned? And what does it mean to you to speak a language?
Yeah. I appreciate the phrasing of that question that way, because what my least favorite question is, how many languages do you speak? Because what happens inevitably over time is that there are languages that you learn that you really don't actually speak very often. So it's kind of difficult. So I've learned in chronological order, uh, English, obviously, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, Arabic, Cantonese, Italian, Thai, and German, but all to very different levels. Some to very basic levels, some to higher levels. Some of them I speak regularly these days. Others I haven't spoken for years, and I'm close to forgetting. So it's a really kind of big mix of of different languages.
Yeah. And that makes you a real polyglot, speaking many languages, knowing many languages.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? What makes a polyglot? I don't I have a lot of polyglot friends, and I think I'm a little bit different to many of them, in that I'm not the kind of person that puts a lot of work into maintaining my languages at all. Um, I, I'm quite happy to go for years without using languages that I've learned, And that's because, like, for me, languages always serve a purpose. So, for example, when I lived in Japan, I learned Japanese. When I lived in Egypt, I learned Arabic. But then when I left Japan and I left Egypt, I didn't really need them anymore. And so I used them from time to time, but not all that much. Whereas other people, other polyglots I know, work very, very hard at maintaining their languages, and they put hours of work in every day to maintaining languages. That's not me at all. So it is, I sometimes have a little bit of resistance to calling myself a polyglot, because I don't always feel that I am. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, we could spend hours discussing what it is to be a polyglot and how do you feel legitimate to call you a polyglot, or if you feel good calling yourself that or not. And I see what you mean with not maintaining languages. I learned German to a quite high level at university, and now I almost forgot everything about it, and I'm thinking I put so much time into this and now I can barely speak. That's such a waste of time and effort. And yet I don't feel any connection to the language, so I never go back to it to maintain or study it, because that would be even more wasting my time.
Well, there's something I'm sure you're familiar with called the sunk cost fallacy, which is the idea that something that you put a lot of time into, that we believe that we have to keep doing those things because we've put the time into it. But that actually really doesn't make sense. And we have to live life based on where we are right now, because life always changes. One of the big events in anyone's life is having kids, for example. And when you have kids, like, your life changes so drastically that it's like your life before and after is unrecognizable. And so the idea that you have to keep doing something from your previous life, it just doesn't make any sense. So I think it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, also in business as well. With the company that I built, so much of what we do relies on not being too attached to things that we've spent time or money on in the past. So I think it's kind of a superpower to be able to say, I spent time on this, but that's okay. I'm going to move on. Life is for living now, not for living in the past.
I love that. I'm gonna frame that above my desk, because that's it's a very valuable lesson in everything we do, like to live in the moment, in the present, and focus on what you need now, not just because you think you should do this or you should maintain this or that language. And I have a question regarding the languages you pursue to a more advanced level, because a lot of my clients, they already have an advanced level, but they want to get even better. And so advanced, I mean, you have an overall fluency with a wide range of vocabulary and the ability to express nuances. What motivated you to pursue those languages and not the other ones, for example?
It was simply my surroundings and the people around me. So, the languages that I've got to the highest level would probably been Spanish and Portuguese. And that was simply because I was with friends. I was spending all day, every day, with people that spoke those languages. There's a concept that Stephen Grasham talks about called community membership of a community, and really one of the biggest predictors of being able to get to a high level in a language is not how much you study it. It's actually, do you become part of this community? Because once you become part of the community, it brings your entire life into focus with the language, and you learn the language not for the sake of the language, but to become a deeper part of that community. And so for those languages that I speak really well, I haven't studied them to that level. I've just spoken them a lot with people, and as a consequence, I've reached those higher levels. Invariably, the languages that I struggle more with, I don't have that community membership. And my Japanese is a good example. Like, Japanese is actually probably my favorite language. I love Japanese. It means the most to me. I can't really explain why, but I've been just studying kind of on and off for years, and I make progress kind of slowly. But it's really nothing compared to when I was learning Spanish and and Portuguese, mostly because I'm just not part of a Japanese community. I have no Japanese family. I have no Japanese friends really anymore. And so there's nothing that's pushing me to close the communication gap and try harder. So yeah, I always feel that it's almost a dangerous game to try to pursue perfection in a language. And there are certain sections of the polyglot community or the language learning community online who really advocate this pursuit of perfection. And I think it's a dangerous game because with the time it's going to take you to achieve perfection in a language, you can do so much else with your life because it takes so long and it's so much work. So yeah, but when I've done it myself, it's just been because I've been in that community and with those surroundings.
So yeah, need for communication and like deeper communication, forming bonds with members of that community, feel like you belong and really get into the culture and how people really think and speak on a day-to-day basis.
But without studying that,
yeah,
as
it just
much
comes
so much
quite
as
naturally,
like
right?
you have a need, somebody says, you go to someone's house for dinner, for example, and you need to be a gracious guest. So you need to make sure that you keep the conversation going, that you offer to do the washing up, or that you're a good listener to people. All these things have nothing to do with the language. It's more of it's a societal thing, a community thing. And you have a deep desire to be a good actor within that community. And so you need to study the language in order to achieve that thing, not for the sake of the language itself. And I think so much of the best language learning practice out there happens when you're not studying the language so much as using the language to do something else.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, kind of one of the most powerful tools we have when we're doing the language sessions is when we finally find that thing that people cannot stop talking about, their passion, and then they forget everything about the language. They just want to communicate and get into an interaction and bring that passion to you and exchange about that. And then the language comes in itself, like it just, everything falls into place eventually with practice and with the passion and the motivation. So
that's it.
And now that we're getting a little bit more into language learning, can we talk about the principles behind the story learning method? Because as a neuro-language coach, many of my clients use your stories and your courses in various formats, and I find they're really great resources to work on the language itself, and because there are cultural elements weaved into your stories. And then this groundwork that they're doing on their own, it makes our individual sessions a lot more productive because we can then focus on their mindset, on the communication, making adjustments to the methods, answering specific questions about idioms, nuances, all that, and practicing specific points. So that's what I like about the story learning and your courses, and all. They really give the power to the learner over the learning journey. And I think you mentioned in one of your videos how to learn a language with stories, I think. You mentioned that the immersion through the stories creates a stronger emotional involvement. It sparks the curiosity in the learner and creates the need to learn those things that you need at that moment, not because the teacher told you you need to speak in the past, but because you do need to be able to speak in the past if you want to tell your story or the point you want to make. And that's something that's quite opposite to what schools do, what traditional curriculums do. So how did you decide to launch this whole story learning concept?
Yeah, so the main principle behind story learning is that I like to think of it as an alternative to traditional learning. And that's the most important element of it, really. Because most people in the world still, when they learn languages, they learn through traditional methods, through an evening class, through the textbook. And that method is essentially one of learning and memorizing vocabulary and grammar. And then the idea is if you do enough of that, eventually you'll have all the knowledge that you need to speak the language. Now that's fine. And lots of people learn languages like that. That's great. But there are also lots of people who find that that method doesn't work for them because it's simply too much to hold that knowledge in your head and then deploy that knowledge word by word, grammar point by grammar point, as you're trying to have a conversation in front of a real person.
It's just crazy.
It's crazy, right? Exactly. And so what I try to do with story learning is to provide a kind of step-by-step framework for learning in the opposite way. So what is that opposite way? The opposite way to traditional learning is to say, rather than learning rules and building up from rules, we're going to start at the top, which is the whole language, stories in the language. We're going to read and listen to those stories. And then through doing that, we're going to decipher what's happening and then learn from those stories. And then the idea is that by doing this, you spend so much time immersed in the language that your brain will pick up far more things naturally than you will through deliberate study in the traditional sense. So if you think of traditional study as bottom up, story learning is top down. But there's a broader goal here, which is to give you the skills to actually be able to read and listen to things in the language yourself. Because if you imagine as a teacher, and Cathy, I'm sure you have this same philosophy, which is that the job of like my job as a teacher is done when you don't need me anymore.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
So my job is to make my ultimate job as a teacher is to make myself redundant. Right. And so the best way that I can do that is by giving you the skills to read books and listen to podcasts and things in the language, because then you don't need me anymore because you will learn by yourself. And so by starting people off with stories, I know that in the long term, you're going to be able to read these things by yourself, and then you'll just keep learning and keep learning and keep learning. And so that's really the kind of biggest gift. And that's why, I mean, a lot of people know me from my books, I think, because they're quite popular. But actually, my story learning as a method is actually, it kind of lives in my courses, because those are teaching people from zero, from day one, using stories. And that's where the method is more explicit, which we can talk about if you like. But that's
the uncovered course, you mean?
Yeah, they're called exactly. So they're called Spanish Uncovered, Japanese Uncovered. I probably need to change the name of those actually to Story Learning Spanish, Story Learning Japanese. But that's a project.
Uncovered.
Yeah, it's close enough. And so, but that's the main idea behind the courses and behind the method. And so, yeah.
Right. And what makes a good story to learn a language?
So the principles of stories never change. Like it is amazing how you have certain story arcs. And I've got a book here actually called it's called The 7 Basic Plots, which is a fantastic book. It's massive, so not for the faint of heart. But every story essentially can boil down to seven, more or less 7 basic plots. And from the simplest stories to the most complex stories, they all have very similar plots. So you have something called the hero's journey, for example, which is where you have the hero who starts off on a mission. He runs into trouble, faces some obstacles, has to overcome those obstacles, and then eventually learns his lesson and then becomes successful. And so really a good story has a very simple premise, and then around that you can construct the different elements of that particular story.
Yeah, and a good story is the one that you just want to keep turning the pages and come back to every day, and that's how you get your immersion every day and your exposure to the language.
I mean, everyone likes different genres of stories. It's one of the things that we talk about quite a lot in our team is what genres of stories we should create, because it's not just in the books, all of our different courses and things are all based on stories. So we have literally thousands of stories that we've had to we've had to write. And obviously I don't write all of those myself anymore. And so we often talk about the fact that everyone likes slightly different stories. And I remember when I first wrote my very first book of stories, which was a book of Spanish short stories, I remember wondering, like, I wonder what stories people like, because I know what I like to read, but maybe you don't like the same. Maybe people like different things. So I did a lot of research, and I discovered that people liked a very specific mix. The people in my audience liked a very specific mix of different stories. So some of the more popular ones were historical fiction, sci-fi, crime, and romance. And many of those I would never have predicted. Especially as sci-fi. I had no idea sci-fi was so popular, but it turns out it's really, really popular. So one of the things we try to do is to create stories in lots of different genres. So even if you don't like the first story in the book, well, hopefully you'll like the second or the third.
All right. Yeah, it's a collection of stories. So you get a bit of for everybody's taste, like for every profile of learner.
The principle there, though, which I think you're referring to, is that whatever we choose to read when we're learning a language, we always have to read around our interests, because if you try to read something you're not interested in, then it could be like pulling teeth. The biggest, the easiest, the best way to help yourself is to choose material you're really interested in. So, for example, I'm reading a book right now in Japanese called Sensei no Kaban, which is actually translates as the teacher's briefcase.
Bag?
Yeah, kaban is actually bag, but in this case, it's like a briefcase connotation. Funnily enough, the English title is totally different. It's called Strange Weather in Tokyo. And so anyway, I read this book in English actually initially. I don't remember why, but I really liked it. And so I thought, I'm going to read it in Japanese. So I went and I got the Japanese version on Kindle, and I'm so much more motivated to read it now that I enjoyed the English version. And the fact that I really want to read it means that even when it gets hard, I still persist and carry on. So yeah, so choosing stories, input, material, content that you really enjoy is such an important step.
Yes, I agree completely with that. And now we've talked about reading stories, but in the learning process, especially at the intermediate level or higher, you usually understand way more complex things than what you're able to talk about. And it can feel very frustrating when you've read this great story and then your teacher asks, so what is it about? And you're like, struggling to get two words together. Do you have any recommendations or tips on how to handle the frustration or keep progressing to be able to finally tell that story?
Yeah, so the bigger picture here is as follows. And this is the principle kind of behind not just story learning, but any kind of input-based learning. In theory, here's how it works. Step one, you read, listen, immerse yourself so much that you learn everything you need to know about the language, the vocabulary, the grammar, etc., etc. And then there comes a point where you know so much that speaking is natural, and you can then say all those things that you know. Now, that's the kind of the theory. Now, in practice, what happens, as you've alluded to, is that it's not quite that simple, because when you first start speaking, you have to. There's an extra step, which is some people call active recall, which means there's something you want to say. I want to say the word briefcase, but I know that I recognize it when I read it, but I just can't think of it right now. Let's call this active recall, or just recall. I like to think of this as a separate step, as a separate part of language learning, because you have to really train these things, You have to train yourself not only to remember words when you need them, or to recall, rather. It's a more accurate word, to recall words when you need them. But you've also got to train yourself to survive the to's and fro's of speaking, because speaking is stressful and it's high pressure. And you've got to be able to, you've got to train yourself like an athlete to actually survive that. You've got to talk with a real human being and be a good conversation partner. You've got to be able to, you've got to have stamina to keep going, and you've got to be able to remember all that vocabulary and be able to think quickly enough to put all the grammar in place that you need.
Yeah.
And so this takes practice. And so what happens a lot for example, in the scenario that you gave here, what's happening is the person just simply doesn't spend enough time speaking. So there comes a point where you have to speak. Let's say that you know it, you've learned everything you need to learn, which of course that never happens, but just broadly, you learn enough and you're ready to start speaking. There comes a point when you have to spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours just speaking.
Just being in the discomfort of speaking, however bad you're doing at the beginning. And
there's no, you can't shortcut this by studying or by doing any kind of like special tricks or anything. I remember when I was learning Spanish and I was in the Canary Islands. I remember my friend Tomasi would take me out to this bar. So he was a Spanish friend that I met in London, and I went to visit him in the Canary Islands, and he took me out to this amazing bar by the sea one night in the Canary Islands, and we were surrounded, and he brought like 10 of his friends along, and these were childhood friends of his, so they spoke in the way that school friends talk, really fast, full of slang, incredibly difficult. And I was there. My Spanish was quite good by that point, so I was speaking, and I remember we got there about 10 o'clock at night, and then we stayed until 4 or 5 in the morning. I remember halfway through that, about 2 or 3 in the morning, I remember my jaw aching, physically really painful. And I was, I've never felt this before. What's going on? And I realized it's because I was there speaking Spanish, which you have to use slightly different muscles.
Yeah, the muscles are different. You have to train them.
Yeah. So I've been speaking there for hours and hours and hours, and I was in physical pain in my jaw from that much speaking. And I realized, hey, this is a real thing. This is what's required here, And I think that people learning a language, especially from home, who are not in an immersion environment, sometimes don't appreciate the fact that you really do have to put a lot of work into speaking at some point.
It's extra effort. And even just reading aloud at the beginning, if you don't have anyone to talk to, just reading aloud to build those muscles, it's one extra step that you can take before you're able to talk to a real human being. All right, we're coming to the end of this interview. That was super interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading all the comments that people are going to leave, because I'm sure there's a lot to talk about following up this interview. And I want to thank you again for being on this video and podcast. And do you want to remind people where they can find you online?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you're listening to this on the podcast, then you can come and listen to my podcast if you like. It's called the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I have a YouTube channel where I publish multiple videos every week all about language learning. And you can just go to YouTube and search for Olly Richards. We're just about to pass 100,000 subscribers as well, which I'm really excited about.
Woo-hoo!
So I need every single subscriber. I need every single person I can get. And if you'd like to find out more about my story learning courses, you can go to StoryLearning.com, and that will take you to the right place.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Olly, and we'll see you again online very soon.
Thanks so much.
Tu ne veux pas manquer les prochaines vidéos? Alors abonne-toi et active les notifications avec la cloche. Et n'oublie pas de mettre un petit pouce en l'air sur cette vidéo.